Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's seminar, a much postponed seminar by Rohit, who is a constitutional legal historian, or a historian of the Indian Constitution. He has just completed his doctoral work at Princeton and is now, and even before he did that, he was appointed to Cambridge Centre for Economic History as a postdoctoral fellow, and also it's simultaneously held at Cambridge and other Cambridge. Yeah, and Rohit was then going on to Yale as an assistant professor once he completes his postdoctoral fellowship. So, very big welcome to Rohit, who is going to speak about a rather corny sounding topic. Says a republic without a pub is a relic. He tells me it's not something he's invented, but it is someone, he's quoting someone fairly eminent. So, there you go. There you go. So, welcome, Rohit.
Thank you, Priti. Thanks to Thinking for having me here. The paper I'm going to present today is part of a larger research project that I'm involved in. I'm sort of going to set up the two questions that drive it. So the first is around the presentist concern for historians, but I was interested by sort of all-pervasive role courts play in public life in India, particularly the Supreme Court of India. And people understand this to be a fairly contemporary phenomenon. So famously, Upendra Bakshi, a critical legal academic, says that it's only post the 1970s the Supreme Court of India actually becomes the Supreme Court for all Indians. The impression there is that before the 70s, the Supreme Court was a rather conservative body which represented interests of largely the property and in many cases obstructed sort of the great plans and transformation of the Indian government. So even people who study the court tend to see the court in two distinct phases. So I was interested both in why the court plays an all-pervasive role and what and whether this sort of periodization of the court's history is one that is sustainable when you look at evidence. The second question that drove me was to understand what it meant for India to become a post-colonial state. And a part of this comes from the fact that much of the writing about the state in India either sort of theorizes the colonial state, particularly 19th century Bengal, or it talks about the contemporary Indian state. And there's very little, and Subir's work is one of the few works that address the topic, which talks about the state in between. And this presents some sorts of challenges to people, to those of us who study the Indian state. Particularly because when scholars write about monarchy in South Asia or about regimes of power in South Asia, the argument is that the kind of regime that's set up in Europe is not replicated in South Asia precisely because we don't have representation. We have, the state can only achieve a certain kind of dominance but not total hegemony. You don't have self-disciplining of people because you have a coercive state apparatus in power. There's not this kind of acceptance that comes about in Europe. So the test then is what happens when democracy is achieved, if we have a certain kind of representation. What happens to this colonial configuration of power? Similarly, the work of Partha talks a lot about the idea of colonial governmentality being based on this idea of racial difference. So even the most universal of rules are seen through the prism of racial difference. So what happens when racial difference is erased, apparently, of 1947? How is this sustained? In some ways, the Constitution was the ideal stage to study this because in some ways it's the sharpest break that we can see from the colonial to the post-colonial. It provides a universal adult franchise, it lays out a dramatic program of social and economic transformation for the state. And importantly, for my paper today, it gives Indian citizens remedies against the state that are judicially enforceable in a variety of ways. So to move to the story of Prohibition, it begins in one muggy night in Bombay on the 29th of May. And Dayam Khushi Desi Kaka, a middle-aged government servant, after dinner goes off on a little drive because it's very hot. As he's driving home on Marine Drive and turning in towards Kolaba, Sindhi couple steps into his car and his car hits them. The police constable arrives fairly soon thereafter, finds that Desi Kaka's breath smells of alcohol. So Desi Kaka is arrested for drunk driving. In the course of the trial, it's found that Desi Kaka is not drunk, his blood alcohol levels are fairly low. It's also found that he was driving very carefully. The accident was So the court finds that he's not to be convicted for deliberately driving dangerously, or he's not to be convicted for drunk driving. However, Peshkaka is arrested because he consumed alcohol. Because this is Bombay in 1950s and the consumption of alcohol is an offense. The evidence of consuming alcohol, of course, is the fact that there is smell of alcohol on his breath. So, what I want to begin with is to sort of look at the prohibition regime in Bombay at this point in time. Prohibition was, alcohol had been regulated in South Asia for a number of years, starting from the 19th century. In the Bombay province particularly, they passed something called the Abkari Act. Abkari is translated to hard water from Persian. And the assumption behind the reason why the government regulated alcohol was because it was a major source of revenue. So what the colonial government would do is that in a total monopoly on the manufacture of alcohol, it would auction off licenses every year to certain people to produce and sell alcohol. And excise revenues from alcohol was the second largest revenue source for the government. So right after land revenue. So around the 19th century, you also see the beginning of the temperance movement in India. And it's almost a universal phenomenon. So in the United States and Britain, you see social movements which talk about temperance and advocate control of alcohol. And some of the arguments are similar everywhere. There is concern that the working class are drinking and becoming unproductive. There's unruly behavior, families are being damaged, children are being brought up properly. And it's sort of a middle class movement, often driven by religious discourse everywhere. But there's certain characteristics that the Indian temperance movement apart from the others. The first is that temperance in India is also a strategic way of hurting the government. So it's very popular amongst nationalists as a way of challenging governmental power. So by advocating temperance, you hurt government revenues. Secondly, temperance is a common meeting ground for different social groups, particularly amongst Hindus and Muslims. It's an issue that both can take up and say, we are protecting our religion and culture by pushing for temperance. Thirdly, of course, is the centrality of the idea that drinking itself is a foreign custom. And for India to be independent, we have to get rid of this foreign custom. Particularly Gandhi becomes an important figure in this respect. Gandhi argues that he makes prohibition a part of Congress's political program. And he argues that Swaraj cannot just be freedom from foreign rule, it also be freedom from foreign customs like drinking. There are two reasons why there's no country that's more suitable for prohibition in India. Firstly, of course, that drinking is immediate life and it's sapping the energies of Indians. And secondly, the intellectual class in India don't drink, so you don't need to convince anyone that drinking is bad. It's patently obvious that it's bad. And we already have a national consensus on prohibition. The only thing that's stopping us is this colonial government, which is forcing Indians in some ways to drink and have access to alcohol. It's interesting, of course, that Gandhi's response to the state has always been, Gandhi's always responded, even when pushing for social measures, he's usually careful about pushing for state intervention. So, in the case of Tolstoy, another issue that Gandhi takes up clearly says one can't have his managed by the state. There can be no compulsion in questions like this. Similarly, when he's very critical of the license permit control that comes up and says, you cannot have government mandated redistribution of property. However, the question of prohibition is very categorical. He's really clear that you need the will of the state to bring about social transformation. And this is interesting, and it shows in a way how drinking is seen by the Congress and by the nationalists. So Gandhi says that Swaraj is not established only by driving out the English. Swaraj does not need freedom to live like pigs in a pigsty without death privilege of anyone. Self-governance requires prohibition to create a healthy public. And famously said, if I'm appointed dictator for a day and I could do one thing, what I would do is shut down without compensation all liquor shops and destroy all toddy palm which I used to make toddy or local alcohol. So when the Congress sort of sets up its first governance in 1939 after the elections in Bombay, prohibition is brought in a phased manner. And Gandhi applauds it, and he says that Bombay, with its dirty chores, overcrowded lanes, uninhabited hovels, becomes truly beautiful the day it goes dry. It's only with prohibition removing the temptation of dirt to drink from the labouring classes could Bombay deal with the problem of improving the conditions of the poor. So it's not surprising that Bombay, in some ways, a quintessential modern city, becomes the site for experiments with prohibition. What better way to transform Bombay's decadent modernity? It's in the hedonistic industrial wasteland, marked with the drinking of the rich and the squalid drunkenness of the workers, than through prohibition. So prohibition was some ways an easy fix to solve the problem of the urban poor and bring the language of through a language of hygiene and morality. The prohibition itself enjoyed wide support across the party from groups apart from Gandhians. So very early groups for prohibition drew in large numbers of women. The role of, in fact, the main political program for women within the Congress for many years was the picketing of liquor shops. People like Nehru, who were not sort of convinced of prohibition on moral and religious grounds, argued on scientific lines that prohibition necessary. So Nehru and Rajgopalachari both authored tracts which mention scientific reasons why prohibition is bad for the body. So in a way, it's a conflation of the body politic and the actual body of the individual, and the way of protecting the body politic by restricting the right of the individual to drink. So as the movement was independence, the government started committing themselves to the prohibition. Most strikingly, the Congress puts it into the Karachi Declaration of fundamental rights and as they move towards making the constitution, prohibition is a demand is increasingly iterated. Interestingly enough, it's not there in the original draft of the constitution. The draft that Ambedkar makes no mention of prohibition whatsoever. When the constitution is being discussed, it comes with a lot of critique for not being Indian enough. And it's the point that Suri actually mentions in his book. There's a line that's used where one of the critics of the constitution says, we were expecting the music of the Veena or the sitar, but we hear the music of the English band. And it's in this context that demands of prohibition come up. So figures like Mahavir Tyagi argue that, and I'll just read out this text because it's quite clear. He says that if we can't accommodate even the idea of prohibition in our constitution, then what else have we been sent here for? We've been talking about revolution, but we can't even have a small reform in our constitution. The book will not be worth touching with a pair of tongs. If this constitution does not contain prohibition, it does not contain Gandhiji, because where there is liquor, Gandhi cannot be. And it's a cause that's taken up even members of the Muslim League who are in the assembly. It's something they unite over again. And they say that prohibition must find a place in the constitution. Our community has no different opinion in this matter. So it's sort of almost a consensus of prohibition that's forged in the Constitutional Assembly. And the idea, I mean, it works at many levels. The idea is that, not only is it moral, it's also part of reconstruction of the state. We're going to have hardworking, sober citizens. We can only come about through prohibition. In an extraordinary speech, the Bombay Minister of Prohibition in a public speech says, in some ways, unrestrained free thinking and unlicensed individual liberty were an ingenious machine introduced by the British to convince the traditionally abstentious Indians to drink. The British economic system corrupted the minds of young Indians who challenged religion, tradition, and shastras and blindly aided the British, taking up drink because Englishmen drank. So he says both drink and the idea of individual civil liberties were poisoned British gifts and had no place in the independent republic. Morarji Desai, that famously dour and humorless chief minister of Bombay, said, people talked about how prohibition had failed in America, and state-mandated prohibition could not work, and the response was, it failed in America because America did not have the moral strength to live under prohibition, whereas Indians from time immemorial abhorred drink and would have no problems adjusting to it. So, the Constitution itself provides prohibition on a section called elective principles of state policy. The Constitution sets up a body of rights and liberties, and as we know, they're not unrestricted rights and liberties, they are qualified on various grounds, which allows for prohibition law to come into place. So, after independence, the variety of states experimented with prohibition, but the two that take on absolute prohibition are Madras and Bombay. Almost all the other states, so Delhi, Orissa, Madhya Pradesh, introduced something called partial prohibition, where certain districts go dry. But the reason why Bombay and Madras sort of declare full prohibition is because both the chief ministers, Morarji Desai and Rajgopalachari, are very committed to this idea of prohibition. At the same time, the Planning Commission launches something called the Prohibition Inquiry Commission, which ultimately finds, despite the loss in revenue, India as a whole must adopt prohibition and it must go dry completely by 1958. So this goal is set for 8 years, and Bombay is in some ways the first experiment. So how would prohibition then be introduced in Bombay? To do so, the Planning Commission urged the states to enact stricter laws to enforce prohibition. And in Bombay, the Prohibition Act in some ways reflected this. So what did the Act do? The 10 commandments of the bill, as they came to be known, stated, no person shall produce, manufacture, possess, export, import, transport, buy, sell, consume or use liquor, except if they have a permit issued to them by the government. The possession, consumption, manufacture, bottling, export of liquor is a non-bailable offence. Anyone found drinking in public would be fined. Anyone found drunk on the streets would be fined. It even criminalized the act of commending the use of liquor. So if if you encourage people to drink, the encouragement itself to print or speech would be a crime. In order to check loopholes, it said if you open a drinking house, if people found inside a drinking house, even though you're not drinking, you're a criminal. It granted vast powers to the police and set up a new body called the Prohibition Police Force. So it empowered these officers to enter any time or night or day without a warrant, any building, warehouse, shop, or search a person on the street. They didn't require a warrant for their arrest. The Act also provided that people who are believed to have committed an offence could be detained without trial and their movement could be curtailed. So it provided a system of preventive detention for people who were suspected of drinking. It created a system that operates outside the usual penal code and the criminal procedure code as well. So it's almost a specialized regime of prohibition that's been set up in Bombay. It's important to note it provided a set of exemptions. So certain categories of people were exempt from the prohibition law, particularly military personnel, foreigners, and former princes. This becomes important later on, so it's good to flag. The other exception were people who were classified as addicts if they could get a certificate from the doctor saying that their health would be impaired and they didn't have drink on a regular basis. So they're so addicted to alcohol, they're driving and would injure their health. As the report pointed out, the prohibition regime created a wholesome dread of committing offence under it. So the year before the enactment of the Bombay Prohibition Act saw about 19,000 offences being recorded linked to drinking. The immediate year after it went up to it went up to 19,000 from 9,000 the previous year, and there was an increase in excise offences of 240%. So also interestingly, the prosecution earlier used to give people manufacturing illicit alcohol, that is, people who manufacture alcohol without a permit, without a license from the government. All the new kinds of people convicted of possessing alcohol or drinking in the first place. So instead of targeting sort of people involved in production, started targeting individual drinkers. And the range of drinkers, if you look at every newspapers every day would carry a prohibition arrest column, and the range of people picked up was very wide. It would include people like the vice president of the Bombay municipality, sarpanches, lawyers, doctors, and leading businessmen. Two sort of the usual suspects, large numbers of tribal workers, Catholic housewives in Bandra who found the bottles of wine, leading courtesans of Bombay found alcohol inside the house. Women were seen as particularly complicit in brewing illegal liquor and transporting around the city. So Bombay sets up its first all-women's police force to tackle prohibition offences as well. There's much excitement about it. Now the idea of exceptional laws is not unique. So even through colonial India, we've seen exceptional laws, state exceptional regimes coming up. Most famously, the Defense of India regulations, and in the case of dacoity and terrorism. But what is it about prohibition that makes sort of drinking equivalent to dacoity and terrorism, a problem of the same magnitude? The answer lies in the way that the post-colonial state views its citizens. So, B.G. Cade, the Premier of Bombay, who sort of brought the Prohibition Act in the first time around, argued that drinking is injurious to the individual and to the public due to increased crime. So alcohol was seen as something that is damaging to society as a whole. Secondly, the kind of people who would drink, and they often identified them as Harijans and working classes, didn't know any better. So we had to intervene and prevent them from doing what is harmful for them. It's a sort of idea that the people who drink don't have the right to make the choice. So famously, as Cade says, it extinguishes the lamp that shows the distinction between right and wrong. Drinkers are incapable of exercising their moral choice, and their rights are not a matter of liberty. So there's no question of liberty that can apply to it. Famously, the Bombay Minister of Prohibition at that point said there's no individual liberty to commit suicide, therefore you cannot have the liberty to drink. And the history of social legislation, they argued, must be a history of curtailing civil liberty. So you can't have both at the same time. So this idea of citizen as a passive recipient of government's programs and not a participant is something that comes into political literature. Shilpa Roy has sort of talked about the idea of the infantile citizen who requires state tutelage protection. And this comes through sort of the two views of the drinker that comes through the discourse. One is this idea of the one person who can't make a choice, can't tell between right and wrong. The second idea is that of the person who's a bad citizen. Look, the state is giving up so much revenue by bringing prohibition to your own good, you're still violating our prohibition laws. Therefore, you must be punished. So the minister said people who sort of knowingly violate prohibition laws are either madmen or they're subnormal. So you must see the welfare of these people. So these people have to either go to a jail or to a mental asylum. They can't be let alone to sort of damage society. Prohibition has been looked upon and studied by very few scholars before, but most notably David Hardiman in Bombay. And the argument usually is that it's always a middle class project. It doesn't capture the masses. And in a way, the resistance is shown from the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are arrested under these laws, showing that they continue to drink and their idea is not changed. What I'm trying to do in the next chapter paper is to show that there's another way of thinking about resistance, which is not just people succumbing to the state. There are ways in which the Constitution allows people to sort of engage in fracture state policy. So, this is a problem of the time which talks about Desai and his pet project of Prohibition. So it begins with a case that's filed the day the Prohibition regime goes into force. And it's filed by a journalist, a Parsi journalist called F.M. Balsara. And he files it against challenges the constitutionality of the Prohibition law on sort of 4 respects. He argues that it's a two-pronged strategy. First, he says the government has not the right to take away his right to consume alcohol. Secondly, he says if the government can take his right away, it cannot grant exceptions to other categories of people. So he makes a claim on the first prong, based on the right to property, that the government cannot take away his right to possess alcohol. It's something that he has. Secondly, it can't take away his right to speech. He can encourage people to drink. It cannot be criminalized. Thirdly, he says that even though it's something that, even if prohibition is permitted, you cannot have exemptions for the various other categories of people. So you can't take away his right to drink but grant at the same time to foreign diplomats or soldiers. And finally, the technical argument says the government has the power to restrict alcohol. The Bombay High Court initially firstly said prohibition is fine and valid and the government cannot Prohibition Act stands good in law. As a principle, the government can restrict the liberty of citizens to drink. However, it said certain clauses of the Prohibition Act are unconstitutional and they could severe those clauses away. So what did they find problematic? They first said that the law or the constitutional provision, if you go back to it, the law only allowed them to prohibit the possession and drinking of alcoholic liquor, but not any item that could be used for intoxication. So the law was used to challenge things like you couldn't possess beauty cologne or perfume with a certain alcohol percentage. And they said, look, it's ridiculous just because something can be used as alcohol, you can't use the prohibition law to stop you from using it. The second argument they made was that freedom of speech holds good. You can't prevent someone from commending or criticizing prohibition policy. It's something that's allowed. Thirdly, they attacked all the special provisions, the preventive detention regime, the arrest without warrant, and said you can't have special procedure just for prohibition. It's not a question of, it's something that's unconstitutional. But what got most traction was the attacks on the idea that the permanent system denied equality at some extent. So this is also what got the most popular press. So Balsara's lawyer engineer said that, look, how can you make an exemption difference between soldiers and regular citizens? If drinking is bad for regular citizens, it must be bad for soldiers as well. So if it makes someone unfit for their duties, how can the army go to drink? The other argument the government made was, look, the army works very hard, they need to cash at the end of the day, to which the judge said, well, in which case peasants work very hard, why can't peasants drink at the end of the day? The second more controversial argument was that foreigners could drink. And the government's response was that we are not responsible for changing the models of foreigners, we have no commitment towards it. But the court said that in the state of Bombay, everyone should treated equally, you cannot have an artificial distinction on the basis of nationality. Either everyone can drink or nobody can drink. And this comes to another argument for the period which started talking about the fact that foreigners drink in Bombay where there's Indian stone. And the 50s is a very important critique to make of the Congress government. The third is, of course, the Indian princes, and this was very easily taken care of by the government. There was no reason why the princes should be given exemption. It was clearly unconstitutional and was struck down. So basically, what the court finally ruled, the court said you can have a prohibition can apply to alcohol, but it cannot apply to beverages which are not by themselves alcoholic or medicines. It says system of permits were unconstitutional, restricting freedom of speech were invalid, and finally said Mr. Balsara must now be given a special topic to go and drink. As things stand, it's not a major victory. The regime of prohibition still stood, exemptions were taken away, but by and large, the structural prohibition wasn't challenged. However, this caused a degree of anxiety amongst the government, and it's worth thinking about why they were anxious. It comes to 2 or 3 sets of areas. Firstly, there was very anxious correspondence between the Ministry of External Affairs, Ministry of Defense, and the government. And both the army and the ambassadors were very anxious that the prohibition being taken away. Secondly, and this is very telling, Sardar Patel sent a letter to the Bombay government asking them to appeal. And Patel has been critical of prohibition in the past. In the 1930s, he said prohibition was an unmitigated disaster and intractable. But here he said our constitution is already so much against us, we cannot accept any further encroachments by the judiciary. So any judgment of High Court constitutional matters that appears unsound must be appealed against. So for him, it's a matter of principle. This is a law that's enacted by a democratic government. It represents the will of the majority. And it's been struck down by the High Court. We cannot allow that to happen. We must go and pursue this further. So the prohibition case, sort of, Balsara's case goes up all the way to Delhi. I just want to flag quickly what are the other factors that would lead to the anxiety, this vital anxiety that Patel expresses. One is that in popular media, Balsara's case, even though it's a case of Mr. Balsara and individuals going to court, comes to be known as the prohibition test case. And we see through the 50s that they throw out these test cases, where you often have an individual who goes to court, but clearly the decision affects people, affects much wider public. Secondly, it's interesting that Balsara's case, the judiciary actively encouraged Balsara to come to court. So initially, there was a challenge, argument made on procedural grounds, saying that Balsara does not have standing to challenge this law. And the court says, yes, we recognize that procedurally he doesn't have the authority to come to court. However, because of that, it's very important to resolve this case. Thirdly, Justice Tendulkar, one of the judges on the bench, begins criticizing the prohibition regime using the language of international law and various other forums. So he gives a lecture in Delhi to international law conference, and he says, that the Bombay Prohibition Act, which enabled the police to raid a man's home, was a violation of the UN Charter. A law that makes a man's home liable to be raided by the police or finding out whether he was committing the heinous crime of having a drink in the evening is Invasion of Privacy and Violence, Article 12 of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. So essentially, there's sort of this popular human rights language that's being used. He ends up saying that by every canon of civic liberty and every principle of civilized jurisprudence, a man's home and private life should be immune from state interference and police inquisition. It's a fundamental human right. A law that offends against these rights cannot be justified merely before it dangles before the public a lofty and unattainable ideal of aesthetic virtue. So there's sort of a popular language of rights judges are using in other forms as well. This is outside the court. And finally, what's like most studios, how the Balsara case becomes a public event. There's a global account in every newspaper about the case itself. The day of the judgment, the street before the High Court is brimming with people. They sort of spilled over to the Bombay and ground in front of the Bombay High Court. People have gathered in the railway stations in Pune, Thane, and other cities in Bombay presidency, waiting for the evening paper to tell them whether the prohibition stayed or not. Newspaper officers have cut telephone inquiries asking the outcome of the case. And it became a topic of conversation in street corners and elsewhere. So it's not a legal spectacle that's playing out public imagination, but Mr. Balsara and the government are sort of going at each other. So this goes to Delhi. It's less dramatic in many respects because the arguments here are less technical, are more technical and less emotive. The Supreme Court in Delhi strikes down the objections to the exemptions by saying you can't make intellectual differentiation between a soldier, a diplomat, a prince, and an average citizen, and says equality only applies to equals, and as long as you can have a rational basis of classification between two categories of people, it doesn't violate the equality. However, they hold two things. One is that you can't use Prohibition Act to prevent drinking possessing other items that might contain alcohol. And secondly, it says that all the restrictions on draconian rules about trial, arrest, warrant are illegal and unconstitutional. Advocate General C.Y. makes a sort of different remark. He says, look, this is clearly a loss of the petitioner who had opened his mind about why to drink intoxicating liquor, but all he can drink now is medicated wine, mixed alcohol, and liquor tonics. So the government is quite satisfied with itself. The Balsara judgment ends with a bit of a windfall, or so it would seem. There's a prohibition. The Prohibition Commission set up. The Prohibition Commissioner writes a report just after the Balsara judgment saying, following the law initially had created a wholesome dread about it. People were afraid of the law, but following the Balsara judgment, we saw a sort of rapid rise in prohibition offences. Somehow this fear seems to have gone away. And now why is this so? And partly we see the answer in Peshkaka's case. So we go back to this Peshkaka was arrested for driving while consuming alcohol. Peshkaka goes to court and says, yes, his breath smelled alcohol. That's because he had a breath tonic that evening. But BG Foss, which was supposed to be a vitamin B tonic, which had 17% alcohol content. To give you just a comparative example, beer around that time had 3 to 9% alcohol content. Sherry and wine would have about 20% alcohol content. So this tonic 7% alcohol content. And therefore, since the government could not prove he had not had BG Foss and had another kind of alcohol, he could not be sentenced by court. And the High Court was sort of disbelieving of him. They said, look, they produced the BG Foss bottle, the smell is not that strong. There's no reason to believe that if he had the tonic flow on the drive, that would still smell. It all sounds very dubious, and we can't open this case. Basically, goes to the Supreme Court, where filed multiple appeals, and finally the court recognized that whatever the matter, onus of proof cannot be against Pesic-Kaka, the government will have to prove that Pesic-Kaka had consumed prohibited alcohol and not something like alcohol he prohibited. Again, it seems to be a small technical thing, except for the fact that following this judgment, we see a spike in the manufacture of all kinds of tonics and drinks. Again, the Prohibition report famously, just to give an example, there was something called a tincture of ginger, which is used for colds, which again had about 20% alcohol. Its production went up from 36,000 pounds in 1949 to 380,000 liquid pounds in 1952, just following the Vatsara judgment. The Bombay government repeatedly complains that these tinctures are being sold everywhere, in hotels, restaurants, coach shops, and barbers. There's pharmacopoeia, there are 43 new tinctures that are created between 1952 and 1963. The Planning Commission sort of says that perhaps we need to go back to old-fashioned medicine, where the pharmacist sort of grinds medicine in the shop rather than people drinking medicine with a lot of alcohol content in them. The next set of cases comes from the manufacturer of something called Hall's wine, which is a very popular health tonic full of vitamins made by a professor at University College London, very popular in Britain and India. The Bombay government initially says, well, because the Supreme Court has said that you can't have prohibition on any other object whose daily use, which might be alcohol, but whose daily use is not alcohol. The government went ahead and amended the law anyway. So the manufacturers of Hall's wine went to court and argued that, look, this amendment is unconstitutional. The Supreme Court requires us to allow other items which are ordinarily used not to be prohibited. The Bombay High Court went after for a while and said that, well, the government was correct, but again, the only proof is the government to show that the person has done something which is prescribed and not something else, and the only way you can tell that is through a blood test, not through sense of smell or any other test. So the court mandated blood test taken of anyone who's arrested for suspected being drunk. So the next year, the government reported they had 36,000 pending blood tests because they didn't have the capacity to do so, and they weren't able to get any convictions through. Also, the blood test itself challenged unconstitutional by another set of petitioners who argued that you could not take someone's blood against his will and use it in evidence against him. So people upheld that and started on an amendment for it. So you had a system of conviction that was rapidly under assault on all sides on procedural grounds and was really under that kind of pressure. What do we make of these series of cases? At one level, they seem very dry and procedural, but I would argue they show certain other glimmers that become important later on. One is it allows, in some ways, you could not criticize prohibition in Parliament because there seemed to be a sort of national consensus that we evolved on it. You could not critique prohibition on the ground that it caused economic loss because the government argued for tainted revenue anyway. You couldn't challenge prohibition on the ground of civil liberties because the argument was that civil liberties, have to sort of set down the socialist progress. However, the critique that was being made was that in some ways prohibition was encouraging people to break the law. And this is a article by Shankar, which sort of says that, picks up on this and says, well, look, prohibition is actually telling people to break laws in British states. So there's a sense that it's leading to a sense of lawlessness around the area. The second sort of, this is another similar critique, which argues that, prohibition is leading to private enterprise, which, there's a large amount of illicit manufacturing that's happening. More cartoons and prohibition. So there's a sort of sense that you can now criticize the government on the language of constitutional administrative procedure emerges as a site through the state policy can be safely criticized. So on the act of the Bombay Prohibition Act, someone wrote Statute of India, a lot of preaching is done invoking Gandhi's name. but nothing is done to follow Gandhi's lead in the right conception. If Gandhi was willing, he fast to see people reform in a so basically criticizing the ruthless and savage manner in which policies have been implemented. Another angry leader drew on Mahatma Gandhi and sort of ideas of liberty by saying that Gandhi was against the absolute powers of the police. How can prohibition sort of give these powers? Prohibition was portrayed as a police raj, complete antithesis of democracy. So they point to the fact that most of the legislators who advocate against prohibition aren't drinkers themselves. So how can they impose their will on the majority of people who would like to drink? As Bombay High Court sort of points out, the second, so there's also a critique of the government, as this government has a lot of power, so it's almost sort of power mad against the people. So the Chief Justice of Bombay High Court reminds the government that alcohol is intoxicant and power is also intoxicant. And this also plays out in sort of cartoons, right? So you see the idea that in the 1950s, the Congress is drunk with power to do whatever it feels like. So this is a cartoon by, they're both cartoons by Shankar. This is a cartoon by Shankar, and this is a cartoon in a film magazine, which was moralized as being drunk with power and demanding more sacrifice. So in some ways, this court is open to space to show that there's a way of critiquing the government for overreaching its own constitutional structure. So the restrictions are, it's a new space to treat them. The second sense that comes from the government initially begins with a degree of confidence in the law itself. It believes in enact social change through law. So every time the court strikes something down, it goes and re-amends the law to make the law more constitutional by allowing it to carry out its aims. But it begins to get tired. So in the assembly, people say every session the assembly reminds the Prohibition Act. Where is this actually going? There's a sense of loss of confidence the government has in itself because of repeated attacks upon the law. And this is reflective, not just in prohibition, but in other aspects of the law in immediately post-colonial India. We see this in the case of land reforms in Delhi. In the sense that every time they patch up a hole, the lawyers sort of go and bury another hole into the fabric of the administration. So the government is always sort of one step behind, trying to sort of make laws work constitutionally. The third thing that sort of these laws allow people to do is it allowed public interest to emerge as it allowed the conflation of private and public interests. So one of the factors someone has picked on is petitioners in both the cases, Ekataka and Balsara are Parsis. Balsara himself is a Parsi journalist and worked for a leading Parsi newspaper called the Jami Jamshed. Now, under the older prohibition regime, when the government would give contracts to sort of sell liquor, one of the main benefactors were Parsis. So a majority of liquor permits in colonial India were held by Parsi merchants and Parsi traders. They were the hardest hit when prohibition comes into force. So earlier in the 30s, there was a whole policy of considering the Parsis. Gandhi would sort of write to Parsis and ask them, give up your right to, give up the state business and join the national. And the Parsis protested, saying that this is how they got their bread and butter, and they couldn't give it up. However, this sort of claim was difficult to make in current India. Parsis had grown politically very minor, they didn't have electoral clout, and it was hard to represent themselves through electoral politics. However, by keeping on the language of civil liberties, allowed, in the case of Mr. Balsara, sort of a critique of prohibition to come through. And there are memories that Balsara's petition is being funded by other people. It's not just an eccentric individual going in. It allows the language of individual rights to be taken on by a larger community. So in some ways, you always sort of think of India as this dichotomy between individual rights and group rights, and it's seen as being categories often opposing each other. But very often, we see the exercise of individual rights is often done by people who feel that their rights as a community have been affected. So Balsara is talking, even though Balsara is presenting himself as an Indian citizen, he is representing in some way, or his task is helping the interests of a community that he is a member of. So this brings us back to sort of, so finally brings back to thinking about how we understand the constitutional order in the 50s. There are sort of three things that stand out. One, that litigation emerges as a new kind of political action that sort of shakes the confidence of the government in law. Secondly, that it allows sort of variety of interests to present themselves and speak through the figure of the individual citizen. And thirdly, that procedural, very dry procedural cases actually have a much larger degree of politics that they are behind. So I think on that note, I'll pause.
Thank you, Rohit. Thank you for a very stimulating talk and some wonderful slides. And I think great selection of cartoons there from the 50s, which I really enjoyed. Now, I was just wondering, I thought we might hear a little bit more, and I thought now might be a good time to. So when people are actually, what are the counter-arguments against prohibition? That, so the arguments for prohibition is that it's unendedness, so-called. So what are people saying? Are they actually rebutting it in public debate on the grounds of not just individual rights, my right to drink, or not on the grounds of liberty, but what are the other kinds of, are there cultural or cosmopolitan arguments being made as what the future of the Indian citizenship should look like? And my other question is related to this. I was quite struck by the fact that this was something that was not in the original text. So Ambedkar had nothing to say on this. When you say he had nothing to say on it, did he never say anything about it? In the sense, in his many arguments with Gandhi, for example.
So, I haven't found any comment by Ambedkar on the prohibition itself, but there are arguments made even in the assembly against prohibition on a variety of grounds. The first is, this is interesting to pick it up. One of them is by Jaipal Singh Munda, who's the tribal leader in the assembly, who makes the argument that drink for most tribals is not a social occasion. It's very much a part of tribal ritual, and it's a part of religion, and you can't take it away from them. The second argument comes from a man called H.K. Khardekar, who was a backward caste leader in the assembly, and this is sort of cosmopolitan argument, where he says that, it's almost lyrical, he says that compare the life in a city like Bombay on dry days and wet days. This is when Bombay was experimenting with prohibition on only certain days. On dry days, you find life really dry and dull. I ask you to see that. You might think this is only for the rich. Everyone that goes to the club is not rich. But what about the poor? Think of the millions of mill hands working hard all day. In the evening, they like to have a glass or two of toddy, which is nothing but fermented, fruit juice. And with vitamins, he gets a little mirth and joy. Why should we deprive him of that? So, the people here, like Dr. Ambedkar, who have solace in reading, why are we taking away the fact that there are workers who have solace in drinking? There are also initially small protests made by Catholics who argue that wine plays an important role in ritual in Catholic churches, and the government agrees to make an exemption for churches to allow for liturgical wine. But both Munda's argument and Khardekar's argument get dismissed, and there's a sense that in a way by making these arguments, they're being selfish and they're standing up, they're putting their individual interests of their group against the interests of the nation as a whole. And there's a belief that what you must have is total prohibition. You cannot have partial prohibition. Partial prohibition cannot work. You must have sort of complete abstinence brought into place. And this comes through, and it's remarkable how great this consensus is. So it's not just the Congress that is pushing it. Prohibition enters the Socialist Party constitution, it enters Communist manifestos, it enters the Hindu right. So there is sort of general political consensus on the question of prohibition in the 30s and 40s. The critique of prohibition, of course, becomes politically taken up by Swatantra Party later on in the late 60s, after Rajagopalachari sort of eases himself out of there.
And that's on the ground. So when the law actually lapses, or is it actually?
Sorry, I should have. I think I left a bit out. So finally, the Prohibition Act is still in force in Bombay, and occasionally you get news stories of. Recently, last year, the police raided some people's homes. A woman was making liqueur chocolates was arrested because she had alcohol without permit. So the regime is still in place, but in '64, Vasantrao Naik essentially says that we've already. The statistics are astounding. He says that we've already done quite a bit. We've arrested, we have convicted. I think it's 400,000 people in the last 10 years for prohibition offences, and I think it's time that we can sort of loosen the regime. So in '64, prohibition is sort of it's not removed, but the enforcement is definitely made laxer. The prohibition police force is dismantled. So there's it's sort of the moment ends sometime in the 60s.
Thanks for a great kind of run through of the early history of prohibition. And I'd like to ask you a question about the history of post-prohibition use of alcohol, because it seems to me that many of the kind of materialistic attitudes that you describe as kind of Congress leadership in the early businesses and revenues derived from local taxation played in the changing attitudes towards constitutional status of prohibition? Because obviously local taxes would be one of the kind of the major staples of sort of state taxation. So what role does taxation play in this story of constitutional development? Look at that here.
So the point of paternalism, I think, is something that has been a recurring theme for the Indian government even today. And this idea that you shouldn't give them, I mean, and it's not something that's unique to India, it's often expressed even in the United States, where the idea that if you give people welfare checks, or even in Britain, they will go spend it on drink. So you should give them food stamps instead. I think that is recurring. I'm not completely aware as to how prohibition policies play in with cash transfers now. The other argument is there's definitely evidence for. So there was a lot of critique of prohibition itself because it meant the government was foregoing a lot of revenue. And K.N. Raj, in one of the early EPWs, and actually the inaugural issue, one of the first issues, says that the government's lost in Bombay 150 crores by opposing prohibition, and there's money basically going to the informal market to bootleggers. However, it's very difficult for this economic argument to be sustained politically. So every time people would make this argument, there'd be like one MP or one MLA would make the argument. So the opponents would say things like this is blood money, and you are not, or they would argue that you're only seeing loss to government, but what about all the benefits to families when they're not wasting money on alcohol? And to be fair, I mean, there was a lot of popular support for prohibition in amongst various social groups. Particularly women voters seemed to find the idea of prohibition. I mean, they were popular and they would go out and support it. So clearly it had a certain kind of political traction. What I was trying to show in the paper, it was very difficult to respond to prohibition through what we think are usual arguments in the 50s. So you couldn't make the argument in cosmopolitanism, you can't make an argument in minority rights, you can't make an argument in economics. What you could critique the government on was at some level not following fair procedure and process. It seemed to be a very safe place to hide all the other arguments and make the argument on those grounds. So you're holding up the government to the standard it set for itself rather than a normative or a rational argument of any other kind.
So I want to ask a question that's kind of more about my work than yours. That one thing that's really interesting to me is the way in which health is deployed in these debates. In part because prohibition and alcoholism and temperance are all basically resolved by 48 with the Poirier report and some of the research done before that.
Yeah.
Right? So the public health apparatus already has a way to manage alcoholism. And also in reference to the social groups, like I can think of AWC minutes that are so taken up with this idea about prohibition. So I wonder if like and also thinking about like Stephen Lake's work on scalar geographies and sex work, right? There's a concern there that, alcoholism leads to like prostitution and all that stuff. So I wonder if like the moral panic here isn't really about alcohol. I guess maybe this is what you're trying to say, but the moral panic here is not at all really about alcoholism, but it's about the possibilities of governing or not being able to govern the body. Is that really what's happening, or is this truly something that's new about the way in which alcohol is regulated?
I think that's actually a very perceptive point. One of the things I do in my project, one of the other chapters I look at the new legislation on sex work that's been passed, and very often you see the same people involved on both sides. A lot of the women who are arrested under the prohibition law are from sort of the districts where they have red light districts, or are women who are identified as courtesans. So there is a conflation of various kinds of uncontrolled bodies. However, I feel in some ways prohibition gets much greater traction than in Bombay and Madras and in other places. And there's something about how it brings together a big set of stakeholders. So it's something on which religious right and various sides can agree upon. No one can come up and speak for prohibition publicly in some ways. There's sort of for drinking publicly. They don't have that sort of voice. The point you make about regime of alcoholism as public health problem is interesting, and that's why they have this exemption for confirmed alcoholics. One of the arguments that Balsara makes, a little elaborate, is that Balsara says the only way I can drink is if I say I'm a confirmed drunkard, and I find that offensive. And there's a longer history of involvement of the medical profession in Bombay. So the doctors start issuing certificates to various people saying that they're confirmed drunkards. And there's almost like a black market in these permits. So there's a critique of the medical profession in Bombay saying that they're complicit in sort of the breakdown of rural law as well. And the doctors themselves often come out publicly and oppose prohibition towards the end of the 50s. So they have these signed letters saying that the prohibition regime is not helping us. I can pull out the direct quote after the talk. But I'd love to know more about what's happening in the 40s in terms of public health crisis.
Michelle.
This paper actually reflected the way the whole discourse happened at a particular level. For example, in the Judy state, the way, and also you highlighted how most of the litigants had some background understanding of their own benefits that they were creating through these judgments. But I'm interested to know about whether the discourse was also occurring at a different level. For example, at the social level, how was the social response to it? Why I'm asking this particularly is because even in the modern state context, for example, if you see the example of Gujarat, where prohibition was applied, and there are other kind of states, for example, Andhra Pradesh or Bihar recently in the 2006 and beyond, when it became much easier to obtain licenses to open liquor shops, and suddenly you see mushrooming of liquor shops all around every village. Almost every village of Bihar today has liquor shops. And what was interesting was that in many of these villages in Bihar, we get reports of where women organize themselves and go and attack these liquor shops. This started actually with Andhra Pradesh. So there is a different kind of response coming from the social aspect of it, and the different kind of understanding and justification coming from the women of society who believe that these liquor shops actually are in a way a reason for their operation at home. So how do you see this discourse? Whether this discourse was there in the 40s and 50s in Bombay when this was happening?
You bring up two very interesting points. One is that is there a different sphere apart from the judicial sphere where the debate is happening? And secondly, are there different groups that have stakeholders in this? Yes, the judicial sphere operates at a certain level and there's a wider public that operates at a different level, but I don't think they're separate from each other. So to go back to an argument that Pastor Chatterjee makes, Chatterjee argues that there's sort of a distinction in India between what he calls civil society and what he calls political society. Civil society is largely the bourgeois groups who work with a certain kind of rationality. They work through institutions like courts and law. And political society is the vast majority of Indians who are not part of this language of rights, of courts, of jurisdiction, and they operate through like going and attacking a liquor shop or mobilizing like a slum regularize. And there's a disconnect between the two. So I think what I'm trying to suggest is that they're feeding into each other. So there's certain direct ways in which judicial discourse affects the outside public. One is that it's being viewed constantly. So there's been, the law code becomes a sort of public spectacle, and I'm not sure when it does. I suspect sometime in the colonial period. But the amount of coverage court cases get in Indian newspapers is much higher than in other jurisdictions. There are a couple of studies that look at it, which compare New York Times coverage and Times of India coverage of courts and the find differences. Secondly, so when the Balsara case is going on, it's being consumed by people are watching what is happening. Secondly, the reason I pulled up cartoons is because there's a sense that, yes, of course, there's a question of drinking, but there's also a question of state power and harassment. And the people who are harassed, of course, the wealthy are harassed, but the majority of people who are harassed are the poor people on the street. Arrests, of course, represent a small percentage of people who are harassed. A lot of people are actually getting bribed. People are coming and asking for bribes for them because they would be picked up on various grounds. It's very easy to convict someone for prohibition offense. You don't even have to have had consumed alcohol. And there's clearly a certain degree of police harassment going on. So there is a sense that these courts have an impact on other people whose harassment goes down. And it becomes very clear because even though Pesikaka clearly thinks up a strategy and gets it by showing the bottle, there are a number of cases where, the people who are, that Heel and Kohli, who are arrested, who produce a bottle of Hall's wine and say we're actually drinking Hall's wine and not alcohol, which is unlikely given how much Hall's wine costs. But the court lets them go. So once the strategy is devised, other people's lawyers can pick it up and use it for other groups of people. So sort of this fear it might be distorted, but it is, the judicial sphere is reflected in the other sphere as well. The second engagement is, if you look at the stuff that's written on prohibition, I mean largely by Hardiman, there's a sense that what's the narrative say about prohibition? You say prohibition is largely a middle class movement. There are occasions like the Devi movement in Gujarat where tribals and other groups sort of pick it up, but it's not sustained. It falls apart because you can't shape you can't reshape the mentalities of subaltern groups. However, while you show subaltern mentalities aren't changed, you show that state power still stays unchallenged. So, the state might not be able to change your view on drinking, but can still arrest you and put you in jail. But what I'm trying to show the judicial sphere allows you to do is it shows a way of fracturing state power. Maybe not completely, but to a certain extent. The second point that you made about women is important, I think, and I think I underplay it when I present this because it often becomes, look, the law was really draconian, that there was a very powerful social movement which saw alcohol as a debilitating, as a bad thing that leads to violence and poverty. Women were often the biggest supporters of prohibition movements, and sort of Gandhi's, there are stories of sort of women picketing shops in Bombay right from the 1920s itself. There are also stories of people attacking Parsi homes in the 20s because they seem to have been linked with the liquor trade. So we have to recognize the fact that there were groups that wanted prohibition, but not necessarily the way prohibition was implemented. And again, prohibition laws arrest women as indiscriminately as men. Certain women, particularly belonging to tribal communities, are seen as people who sort of distill the liquor, so they're the ones who are picked up and arrested. So it's not as simple as, even when we recognize the different social groups, even though social groups have complexities within. So
I just wanted to go back to the question of paternalism, and in a way, it's prohibition. It exemplifies in some ways the central self-understanding of the Constitution as this paternalist act to protect people from their weakness of will in a way, but also this question, the kind of anxiety about the impairment of reason, which is there so much in the Constitution, and this is clearly one of those areas. And you didn't mention elections, but that's an area where I believe there's specific law about alcohol being banned at the time of elections. I think it's the Election Commission that can actually brings those laws into play, or
People's Act. I
I
think the election has the power to bring in a lot of things to temporarily to control things during election time.
Still dry day.
Yeah.
Election day is still dry
elections
day.
are
Yeah.
always dry
Empowerment of reason, yeah.
Right, so it connects to, yeah.
But I think it's a kind of very deep aspect of how the Constitution is a description of the political process sees itself. It is about reducing the impairment of reason as much as protecting the health of bodies and so on. I just wondered if you'd looked at it all in some election times and what happens.
I mean, not specifically. What I did look at was whether any candidates running on anti-prohibition platform, and Balsara ran as an independent candidate and lost. And there are some propaganda, sort of these movies that were made which are about, how to vote, which always talk about how you should not take food and drink from candidates before the election, but not specifically vis-a-vis this. I want to pick up the other point that you mentioned about the Constitution's paternalistic document. I think that's clearly how a number of framers saw it, but what surprised them was that other people could use it in a different way. So if you make the argument that people who drink are irrational and can't exercise reason, but you have someone like Balsara who's clearly using reason, presenting himself as a very rational actor, using the Constitution and coming up and speaking in public, I think that does something. So a lot of literature on sort of state formation always talks about, or even Mitchell's argument, right? So the state is where citizens see the state, but how do we think of moments where the state sees citizens? So the state might imagine citizens to be passive objects, but suddenly in court they're confronted with a citizen who sort of goes against what they would imagine a passive person saying. So it allows for this space, and it's unexpected. You see that from Patel's response, I find very interesting because Patel himself is not a huge supporter of prohibition. In the 30s in Bombay, experiments with it briefly, he's very critical of it. But for him, it's this sort of moment of shock that, people are using the constitution against the government. This is not something we had expected. Our constitution was supposed to give people these, it's not somewhere where they imagine that legitimacy would be contested. And I think that's what's sort of powerful space opening up. There's a very trite distinction, but it's powerful, made by Stanley Levinson. There have been two kinds of ways of reading constitutions. One is the Catholic way, where you have one body or one authority which interprets the constitution, and a Protestant way where everyone sort of picks up the constitution and has their own reading of it. So I think what I'm trying to show, and hopefully will be more polished about it later on, is that inadvertently or someone slips it in, by having this provision of judicial remedies, you have this possibility of the elected government enjoying a little of credibility running up against sort of other views of reading of constitution. So, and having to answer that in public. So, it's not something that they can dismiss, not something they can wash away. They have to go and answer that through reason in public and reply to Balsara. So, even cases where people like Balsara lose, they manage to bring the government to come out in public and answer them. And even that loss means that the government has to do the reading in public. And I think that sends off some kind of signal.
I just take up your last comment. Robert Cover has this thing about juris-generative and juris-pathic, and how different communities use that. And it's interesting because I was just listening to the presentation. It's just amazing the similarities between the alcohol prohibition and the prohibition on sodomy, and the court and the kind of description of that, and the people who kind of argued for the sodomy law. Basically, talked about the people like homosexual in terms of intoxicated individuals, people who can't think properly. And the exercise of certain, or the claim of certain rights is one that was unruly, for example, without rational thought. And it kind of brings me one question about what do you think of what's the mode of citizenship that you're trying to get at? What in either by self-perception or the Supreme Court or public discourse, what's the ideas of citizenship or the types of people that are coming up to the Supreme Court in this period of time? And the other question I had was, and you kind of answered it already, about the place of the court in the post-colonial movement. You've said kind of given an estimation of when it happened. You said late 30s and 40s. But why does the Supreme Court or the judiciary in India have such an important public persona, which doesn't occupy elsewhere?
That's okay. So what did you mean by different categories of citizens in terms of your second?
Like, is it a rational citizen exercising rights? Right. Is it an unruly citizen who's kind of taking apart the constitution and using it against the government?
Right. Okay. So firstly, I think both you and Rachel are on to something which I think we should think about more. It has something to do with this idea of a body that can't be managed, which has to be now managed by this new state, which I have to think about. So thanks for that, the connection with sodomy. I think the citizen, I often get asked the question, is this something that's internal to the people going to court themselves? Have they internalized the constitution? Do they believe in rights? I don't think it's a question that I can answer. But clearly what's happened is there's sudden visibility of this strategy to occupy the space and be, it's always rational. It's always people saying that, we are merely holding the government up to the standard that's set for itself. So these are not unlike the cases that happen now, dealing with social economic rights, where people demand new rights or more liberal readings. Here the argument is that they're often asking for sort of, the bare minimum, just demanding the state follow its own procedures, the state apply equality across the board, the state follow all the stages. So it's almost dry proceduralism. I actually want to challenge the initial categorization that this sort of open court is something that happens after the emergency. I think there are glimmerings of this that occur in this period. So the Prohibition test case is only one of the big test cases. The others include things like the sweepers test case, where the municipal sweepers who had gone on strike are prosecuted for violating the Essential Services Law, and they challenge that. There's a public streets test case where shopkeepers go to court. So there's a sense that, as a group, even though the case is filed by an individual, there's a sense that it's not just about an individual, it's about a wider public. So there's a certain kind of notion of public interest that's emerging there, and it's something that courts recognize. So by waiving sort of the early procedural requirements, the Bombay High Court is important enough for us to set this procedural requirement aside. So it's not the language that we see in the 70s, but the procedures are already coming into place. The third, of course, is the idea of the judges speak this. So the image that Bakshi and all present is of judges that represent primarily the interests of the ruling classes. And at a very broad level, that's probably true. But if you look at it more closely, they work differently in different situations. And you see a lot of international human rights language creeping in. And one of the things that I later on discovered is that the Ford Foundation in the 50s is a program of creating the rule of law in India, and they're sending in American pamphlets and sending judges sort of international cases. So there's a sort of cosmopolitan judiciary that's been created fairly early on. Why the courts occupy such a central stage, I don't have an answer. I have a bunch of theories. One is it's done by the constitution itself, because what the nationalists... So in a way, the Congress is one of the challenges to the British government is that the British claim to establish the rule of law, which never actually bring about. So we will bring about the rule of law by ensuring that a lot of what we want to do is put into the law. So the constitution is vast, it's enormous, it covers a whole variety of things. But by doing that, automatically everything becomes justiciable. So because it's in the constitution, you can now take it to court. And I think it's to do with not so much with judges, but with lawyers who find this as a lot of problems that would be resolved outside courts early on through either political action can now be taken to court and made into a legal issue. And I think it's a larger conversation as to why the courts sort of continue to play the role. I mean, there are lots of other things happening, but it's thanks. It's like definitely worth picking through.
Can I ask one last question?
Sure.
And it's about that Bulgarian list of exempts you drew for us.
Yeah.
I think some of these are more obvious than others. And I really wanted to ask, and I think there was something in it that, well, there were addicts, you said, and there were people from the military and medically dependent individuals who were exempt from or under this act. But the person that really struck me was the princess. And if there was some, and I think especially given that much of this, the moral weight of this argument was coming out of, discourses like Swaraj and self-governance, and so I was wondering if there is some, how does the exemption of Indian princes sit with what Prohibition had to say or was trying to constitute out of ideas of what is the unregulated body, or is the unregulated subject, or in governance, in terms of self-governance.
So I think the sort of government response is the princes occupy a very weird position in India in the 50s, because the constitution still recognizes a variety of privileges, titles, and privy purses. Several of the princes are appointed as governors of various states as well. So the prince's argument is that our right to drink is part of our existing privileges and you can't take it away.
So it's a competing sovereignty.
Yeah, so and this is something that the Ministry of Home Affairs accepts. And they try to defend in court. It doesn't stand initially. The Bombay High Court strikes it down, but the Supreme Court says, well, there's no specific argument about it, but it says you can have exemptions if you can show rational differentiation. But you're right. There's this idea of they're not completely under our control. And I mean, a more pragmatic thing is that the government's not interested in. I mean, there are 400 of these people, so it's not interested in necessarily taming this group.
But doesn't the foreignness of liquor then completely drop dead at this point if you're Indian princes drinking?
Yeah.
Okay.
The exemptions to foreigners actually created a great deal of public uproar as well, because there were all these comments about we have fought against racial distinctions all the time, and we can't believe this government's actually sort of doing this for us.
Well, thank you, Rohit. Thank you for a wonderful paper, and look forward to reading the final version of it.